So hello and welcome to the Maths Guide. Last week we were talking about sums of values and adding VAT, and I'm going to have a look at that in a minute, but let's have a look at some questions first of all that we would have done in primary school. So Mark eats 2/5 of a bag of sweets. There are 9 sweets left. How many sweets were there originally? So in questions like this, we're trying to understand what fractions are. We start off with a certain amount of a thing. This is just going to be our thing. And we split it into fifths. Mark eats 2/5 of a bag of sweets. So we're thinking about, we've got 1 unit here. This is just a revision of primary school stuff. We break it into fifths. We remove 2/5, and we know that when we remove 2/5 of something, we are left with 3/5 of something. So we know that 3/5 of the original bag of sweets is 9 sweets. Okay? And that's just how we do these questions. If you remove 2/5 from something, you're left with 3/5 of the original amount. So we think of the original amount. That's a phrase you should get into your head so that you can understand it. 3/5. I'm going to write it slightly differently. I'm going to say it's 3/5 like this. Of the original is 9 sweets. If 3/5 is 9, then 1/5 of the original amount is 3 sweets. Okay? If 3/5 of something is 9, then 1/5 of the original amount is 3 sweets. Let's look what we did there. We went from there to there. We divided by 3 to find 1/5. We then multiply by 5 to find 5/5 of the original amount would be, multiplied by 5, 15 sweets. So the answer to our question is there were originally 15 sweets. So that's pretty straightforward. This is something you've done in primary school, and it's understanding fractions. Now, the thing about understanding fractions is you deal with things like halves and thirds and quarters all the time. It's something you get very used to. But different fractions you might have difficulty with. We'll come to that in a minute. Let's have a look at, instead of decreasing something, what happens if you increase something. So the length of a table is increased by 1/5. How long was it originally? This is exactly the same idea. You have something here. You break it into fifths. This is the original amount. We think of this as the 1 unit. You break it into fifths. Okay? You're going to increase the table size by 1/5, meaning you increase it by the same amount as this fifth here. How long is it now? How long is it in comparison to how long it was originally? Well, let's have a look. The original table was 5/5 of the table. We now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6/5 of the original table. And in the question, we're told that that is 6 meters. Again, we do the same thing. We find what 1/5 is. 1/5 of the original table would be 1 meter long. So that means that 5/5 of the original table is 5 meters. So we know that our original table was 5 meters long. It was increased by 1/5, which brought it up to 6 meters long. So when we say 5/5 of the original table, we mean the original table. So the length of the original table was 5 meters long. Now again, as I said, when we're dealing with fractions, we're very used to dealing with halves and thirds and quarters, and even fifths. We're actually not bad at doing things like that. When it comes to percentages, we tend to do quite poorly because we're not used to dealing them within our mind, so we have to practice using them. So let's have a look at saying we have a sum of money. Okay, and we're going to say this is decreased by 15%. Let's go back to our original. What did we do when we were talking about fifths? We took our original, we split it into fifths, and we removed 2 of them. This is not so easy to do when we have percentages. So we kind of have to get the idea that this whole thing is 100%. This is exactly the same idea. We're going to be cutting off 15% of it. And if something is decreased by 15%, we are left with 85% of the original amount. So let's say we are told in the question that a sum of money is decreased by 15%, and there is now €85. And the question is, how much did I start with? I would do exactly the same thing as I did in the fractions questions. I would say 85% of the original amount is €85. I would say 1% of the original amount is €1. What did I do? I divided by 85. In exactly the same way that I divided by 3, I'm dividing by 85 to get 1%. What's the whole thing? The whole thing is 100%. So 100% of the original amount means the original amount. What did I do in the fraction? I multiply 1/5 by 5 to get 5/5. So I do exactly the same thing here. Little reminder of percentage. What is a percentage? What's 1% mean? It's the fraction 1/100th. So we have 1% to get 100%. We are multiplying by 100. So we also multiply by 100 to get €100. So I started with the original amount, which was €100. Okay, so get this idea into your head. Think of the phrase the original amount, or some fraction of the original amount. That's a phrase you want to have in your head all the time. I see people doing questions like this and they say 85% is €85. I want you to get it in your head that you're saying 85% of the original amount is €85. If you say things out in English, you know what you're talking about. Okay? So there is a sum of money that was decreased by 15%. Let's have a look. Let's say we have a sum of money that's increased by an amount. A sum of money is increased by 12.5%. The total is now €180. This would be typically quite a hard question for you to do, to figure out, unless you realized what we're talking about. You draw the picture. This is the original amount. The original amount. This is 100%, is that length there. Like the table, think like the table. When I had the table, I had the original, I had the original length of the table and I added 1/5 of the original length was added on. In this question, the original amount has 12.5%. Sorry, it'd be more like that. Of the original amount is added on. So how much do I have? I have 100% of the original amount plus another 12.5% of the original amount, which is 112.5% of the original amount. Okay, so that's how these questions work. You're increasing or decreasing something by a percentage, we're going to end up with a certain percentage of the original amount. This is a fraction. The fraction is 112.5 over 100, or 9/8 if you prefer that sort of thing. But let's not worry about that. We're dealing with percentages. Let's continue to work with percentages. 112% of the 12.5% of the original amount is equal to 180 euro. Divide by 112.5 to get 1% of the original amount, which will be equal to 180 over 112.5. What do I want? I want the original amount. What is that as a percentage? It's 100% of the original amount. What have I done? I've multiplied by 100. It's exactly the same as the fraction. This is just because you're not used to doing it with percentages. I just have to really spell it out here, but it's the same thing that you've done since primary school. 100% of the original amount will be equal to, what did I do? I multiplied by 100. So I do the same here. 180 over 112.5 multiplied by 100 over 1. You stick that in the calculator and you get 160. Okay, and that will be euro. Answer is 160 euro was the original sum of money. This is called a unitary method, where you find one of the original amount and then you find the original amount. In this case, a percentage. Okay, so that's the way you do those questions. Of course, you might find that there's a quicker way of doing that, but this is the idea I want you to get into your head first. So get this idea into your head first for figuring out the original amount of a sum of a money when you have it increased or decreased. So remember, if the sum of money was decreased, you're going to be decreasing from 100%. If you're decreasing by 15%, you're left with 85% of the original amount. If you increase by 12.5%, you now have 112.5% of the original amount. In exactly the same way that if a table is increased by 1/5, you now have 6/5 of the original table. So sum of money increased by 12.5%, you now have 112%, 0.5% of the original amount is 180. If you decrease, you're going from 100% down to 85% of the original amount. But you do the same thing. You divide by this value to find 1. You multiply by 100 to get the full original amount. So that's how you do questions involving increasings or decreasings by a percentage. Where do we meet increasing and decreasing by percentages? Well, when you add VAT, you're increasing by a percentage. When we're looking at cost and profit, you're increasing and decreasing by a percentage. When your car devalues, it devalues by a certain percentage every year. When you make a percentage loss, you're decreasing by a certain percentages. All of these questions you can do in exactly the same way. It's really simple. Divide by 85, multiply by 100, for example, when you have 85% and you want the original amount. And we'll look at doing that in one step in the future, but for the moment, take the 2 steps. Okay, so that's just dealing with percentages in exactly the same way that you would deal with fractions, in exactly the same way that you would have dealt with them in primary school. These are the sort of questions you had in primary school. You ate 2/5. You were left with 3/5 of the original bag. You find 1/5 by dividing by 3. You find 5/5 by multiplying by 5. Of the original amount is the phrase you keep in your head all the time when you're working with this. Okay, so the best of luck. Enjoy the questions.